what Jewish community ended up in Ethiopia. Quite a number of theories have been put forth, and we're going to be spending quite some time on it because we're going to have the opportunity in the course of doing so of looking at some other very interesting and exotic communities. So let's begin. In looking at the Ethiopian Jews of today, the first thing we should look at is what are they referred to as? We've been referring to them thus far as simply the Ethiopian Jews. And as a matter of fact, in modern times, up until very, very recently, they've been called the Black Jews of Abyssinia. But what they themselves have called themselves and what their neighbors have called them for quite some time is Falasha. The word Falasha means those who have migrated. In other words, immigrants or foreigners, which is very interesting considering that they themselves claim that, of course, they are foreigners because they originally come from the land of Israel. That's not to say that that is necessarily why they are called Falasha. That may be completely unrelated, but the fact remains that they are referred to by their neighbors as immigrants. In this politically correct age, that term no longer is able to be used, and therefore they are generally called the Beta Israel, or the House of Israel, which is another name that at times they refer to themselves as the people of the book or the House of Israel. And I have yet to hear anybody refer to them as African Israelis. Perhaps that term is already quite taken up by the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, and Libyan Jews who are already living in Israel with their descendants. But whatever the case might be, you're going to find the Ethiopian Jews referred to by these many different titles, and so in doing your own research, you should be familiar that the Falasha, the Beta Israel, the Jews of Ethiopia, and the Black Jews of Abyssinia are all one and the same people. Very interesting to look at when looking at any community is their leadership. Oftentimes it is the leader that defines the community, the leader that makes the community, and hopefully the leader is the one who is actually representing the interests of the community. So what sort of leadership did the Ethiopian Jews have? Well, until fairly recently, the Ethiopian Jews had a caste of monks and nuns, celibate monks and nuns, which no other Jewish community has, unique to the Ethiopian Jewish community. However, these celibate monks have only occupied a celebrated position within the Ethiopian Jewish community for a short period of time. It's been estimated that they may only have had this caste from approximately the 1400s, which is not much of a problem, considering that there is a growing consensus, far from an actual consensus, but there is a growing majority of scholars who are of the opinion that the Ethiopian Jews are only dating back as Jews to about the 1400s, which obviously we're going to spend some more time discussing. And today, as mentioned, the power and influence and interest within the community of becoming monks and nuns has waned to an extraordinary degree, and there are almost no young Ethiopian Jews who are joining this group of monks and nuns. They were considered to a degree something like saints and perhaps even prophets of the community, and their power has already waned over the course of the past 100 years. And today in the state of Israel, the power of the monks has gone from diminishing to vanishing. Now, the Ethiopian Jews did have a king. They had kings and queens and real autonomy up until the 1600s when they lost their independence and their king Gideon was killed. There was one famous, very celebrated Queen Judith who apparently ruled over all of Ethiopia and was connected with the Ark of the Covenant. Some of you may be familiar with the theory that the Ark of the Covenant is currently being held in Ethiopia. The Ark of the Covenant that once stood in the Holy of Holies in the temple. As a matter of fact, there is a small church in Ethiopia which supposedly holds the Ark of the Covenant, and an elderly man is the only person allowed to actually enter and gaze upon the Ark. And apparently the tradition has it that on his deathbed, he must appoint his successor, who is the caretaker to the ark, just as a man prior to himself appointed him as successor on his own deathbed. And thus shall it continue until the days of the Messiah. But of course, we've all been educated by Steven Spielberg and Harrison Ford that the Ark of the Covenant is actually in a giant warehouse, where it's not categorized and cataloged, and therefore will never be discovered. The truth of the matter is that the Ark of the Covenant was very likely buried on the Temple Mount, and if it survived the various conquests and plunderings of Jerusalem, then it may very likely have been destroyed within the past very few years. Without getting into too much detail, suffice it to say, you can do the research on your own. The Muslims on the Temple Mount at the Haram al-Sharif, or Al-Aqsa as they prefer to call it, rather than Temple Mount, have been steadily destroying every single Jewish artifact that they've come across on the Temple Mount, so as to make some sort of political point about how the area is Islamic and not Jewish. Obviously, that is a point of view that is ridiculed by all scholars around the globe. Nevertheless, they go about with a frenzy, destroying everything that they can on the Temple Mount. And the saddest part of the story is that the Israeli government, fearful of causing a riot or a ruckus or more international condemnation, which seems to fall like a waterfall, the Israeli government does not stop them from engaging in this destruction, in this larceny, and in this burning of ancient history. And despite the requests and the beggings of archaeologists around the globe, no archaeologist is allowed on hand, and everything is being destroyed without a trace. And if the Ark of the Covenant is under the Temple Mount, it very likely has been found and destroyed within the past few years, although obviously we all hope otherwise. In any event, in recent times, the monks have made way for the kesses, or in Hebrew, the kesim. The kes is a man dressed all in white. A very striking figure he poses. The kes has recently taken over from the monk as the leader of the community, and in very recent times, rabbis, mostly Orthodox rabbis among the Ethiopian community, have taken over the leadership from the keses. The kes in white took over the leadership from the monk, and the rabbi in skullcap and tzitzit has taken over the leadership from the kes. The kes is a very interesting type of leader. The kes, I suppose we could call perhaps a combination Orthodox rabbi, witch doctor, and American, say, Protestant minister. Like the Orthodox rabbi, it's his job to know Jewish law and to decide Jewish law according to their understanding of Jewish law. Like a witch doctor, it's his job to magically heal people and do other forms of magic. And like an American minister, it is his job to lead the people, to teach morals, and to be an example for the rest of the people in his congregation. But as mentioned, the kes is becoming more and more of an outdated feature among the Ethiopian Jewish community currently living in Israel, who look to political leaders and to rabbis as the leaders of their community, and not so much anymore to this very interesting makeup of the kes. Interestingly, the first actual Ethiopian Orthodox rabbi in the community was not an Ethiopian Israeli, but rather an Ethiopian American, a fellow by the name of Rabbi Helu Paris, who was ordained by Yeshiva University in New York decades ago. He came with his family as a child around 60 years ago to New York, and after he was ordained, he joined as an assistant rabbi and later as the official rabbi, a congregation of black Jews in the Bronx. Black Jews in the Bronx? Absolutely. What many people don't realize is that at one point there were thousands and thousands and thousands of black Jews across America and a great many in the Caribbean. There were many Ethiopians who were among these black Jews, some of whom were descended from the Falasha, many of whom were not, but decided that they were Jews nonetheless, and we'll see what evidence they have for that within the course of our discussion on the Ethiopian Jews. And many of them were not descended from Ethiopian Jews, but rather from other peoples around Africa, who for one reason or another decided that they wanted to belong to the people of the book. And so you had these thousands and thousands of people. Almost none of their descendants, however, today identify as Jews. There's an interesting group, perhaps most recently and most famously, headed by a guy named Ben Carter, an African-American from Chicago who later changed his name to Ben Ami Carter. Ben Ami would be a cute play on words. Ben Ami means son of my nation. And Ben Ami Carter with his people entered the land of Israel surreptitiously and made their homes in Dimona and have lived there for decades, despite the fact that they are not considered citizens of Israel and they are not considered Jews. But their point of view, the black Hebrews as they call themselves, their point of view is rather unique and somewhat different from the point of view of Rabbi Helu Paris and of the other black Jews, whether those that were accepted as Jews by the Jewish community, those that were not accepted. These black Hebrews are not accepted as Jews. They're a very interesting group of people. They dress in very bright, resplendent colors. They dress actually in Gaddafi clothes. They are strict vegetarians, and they speak a very interesting Afro-American, they refer to it as jive. They speak a jive English and even a jive Hebrew. And their point of view used to be a very anti-white and anti-Jewish point of view. Their point of view was, well, for one, they continued to believe in Jesus and the New Testament, but in addition, their point of view was that the Jews of today are descendants of the slave owners who beat their ancestors. They say, or said rather, that their ancestors were Jews, but then white slave owners beat their ancestors into making them forget their Jewish religion, and then they took this Jewish religion for themselves. And therefore, all of today's Jews are descended from these white slave owners. I suppose it's a little bit more believable than the Nation of Islam's doctrines of faith. The Nation of Islam believes that white people are the blue-eyed devils. White people were created by some evil rogue black scientist, and that's where white people come from. So I suppose the black Hebrews have a little bit more believable point of view. Nevertheless, obviously, their point of view was extremely anti-Semitic and won them very few friends in Israel. And therefore, over the course of the past few years, in an attempt to gain more recognition in Israel, they changed their point of view, and they say today that, of course, all Jews are Jews, including them. All that they want is to be considered equally Jews. They don't want to move anybody else away from their identity as Jews. And it's working. They are gaining recognition, despite the fact that their claim to Jewishness rests entirely upon the prophecies of Ben Ami Carter of Chicago, but their claim to Jewishness is being taken more seriously by Israel and by the Israeli Jewish community than it was when they were more anti-Semitic. As for Rabbi Helu Paris, I came across a number of quotes from Rabbi Paris that were very different from standard Judaism. I came across a number of quotes, apparently said by him, that were of an extreme Afrocentrist nature. If anyone's unfamiliar with it, Afrocentrism is a very understandable reaction to the terrible degradation that black Americans have been under for a very long time, and the terrible circumstances under which they were brought to this continent. Nevertheless, Afrocentrism is pseudoscience at its best, and it claims that all of the good ideas that the Greeks had, that the Sumerians had, that the Romans had, that the Jews, the Christians, and Muslims had, were all stolen from black Africa. And I read a number of statements by Helu Paris that seem to have supported that idea that Judaism was stolen from black Africa, which certainly is not the traditional point of view, but I'd prefer to give him the benefit of the doubt, considering that he was ordained by a very reputable yeshiva university, and perhaps the people quoting him were themselves putting words into his mouth. In any event, he certainly is the forerunner of the Ethiopian Jewish connection with Orthodoxy, which today in Israel has mushroomed to an extraordinary degree. As for the religion of the Ethiopian Jews in Ethiopia, it was basically biblical Judaism. They did not have the oral law that went along with the Bible. All they had to work with was the Bible. Though, of course, without a central authority and without a tradition, the Bible can be interpreted in many different ways. Perhaps the most notable thing that you would discover were you to be with Ethiopian Jews when they were still in Ethiopia was that they still practiced Tumah and Tahara, impurity and purity, the laws pertaining to impurity and purity, in that they were very careful what they touched and who they touched, what they ate, how they ate it, where they went, something which Jews today, even the most Orthodox Jews, unless they are Kohanim, and even if they're Kohanim, there is no way to compare the carefulness of the Ethiopian Jewish community when it comes to matters of impurity than to world Jewry as a whole, considering that today there are no sacred foods and no sacred places that Jews go, and therefore people are not nearly as concerned about the laws of purity and impurity as they were when the temple stood. As well, biblically, the Ethiopian Jews have a number of sacrifices, most notably the Paschal sacrifice at Passover time, and they have all the holidays mentioned in the Bible. They also have a holiday that is unique to them, a holiday called Sigd or Siged, in honor of the Messiah, in honor of the giving of the Torah, and in honor of Jerusalem. When the Ethiopians would walk sometimes for days to the nearest high mountain, they would climb the mountain, and at the top of the mountain, the leader would read from the Torah and everybody would pray. This holiday included fasting, it included feasting, although obviously not simultaneously. And today, this holiday in honor of Jerusalem, in honor of the Torah, and in honor of the Messianic redemption, for most of the Ethiopian community, thousands upon thousands of Ethiopian Jews, takes place at the Western Wall. The Western Wall surrounding the Temple Mount, the Kotel HaMa'aravi, the Wailing Wall, which is extraordinary because the gaze upon the side of the Temple Mount is what this holiday is all about. And today, dreamily, that is where the holiday takes place. As for punishments, the Ethiopian Jewish community not very long ago practiced skila, stoning, for people who ate chametz, for people who ate leavened products on Passover. According to Eldad the Danite, who is a very unreliable individual, but whom we'll discuss in much greater depth later on, Eldad the Danite claimed that many years ago, over 1,000 years ago, the Ethiopian Jews, if one agrees that he is from Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Jews practiced all 4 biblical forms of capital punishment: stoning, burning, strangulation, and using of a sword. Although, as mentioned, Eldad is not very reliable, nevertheless it is interesting if this were the case. The Ethiopian Jews practice circumcision, which some would claim is support and perhaps even proof of their Jewish descent, because they practice circumcision like Jews do. But please recall that Muslims practice circumcision as well, as do a great many African tribes. And similar to many African tribes, the Ethiopian Jewish community were also practicing female circumcision, which is known in the West as female genital mutilation, and is not practiced and has never been practiced by any Jewish community whatsoever. Therefore, one cannot necessarily say that their circumcision, which, by the way, they could see easily in the Bible, one cannot necessarily say that their circumcision is descended from the Jewish practice of circumcision. Another very interesting matter related to the Ethiopian Jewish community is that they did not eat Eiver min hachai. Eiver min hachai literally means limbs from a living animal, and the Bible demands that no Jew or Gentile eat part of an animal that is still alive. Now, when I was growing up, I found it ridiculous to think that anybody would eat part of a limb of a living animal, but in Ethiopia, as a matter of fact, it is common practice, or at least until recent times, it was common practice to eat part of a living animal. When people would go on trips, they would take a cow along with them, and at dinner time, they would cut away part of the cow's skin, they would carve out a piece of meat, fold the skin back over the wound, and they would fasten the skin back to the cow with little skewers. The Jews naturally abhorred this practice and did not eat flesh from live animals. The Jews, on the other hand, did not have any Hebrew, so that's a mark against them. But they did have some Hebrew words. Although they didn't have Hebrew writing and Hebrew language, they had a few Hebrew words in their vocabulary. For example, the word shofar, which means a horn, such as a ram's horn or some other kosher animal that is blowed on the high holy days. As well, very interestingly, they had the word goyim, meaning Gentile. Now, the word goyim today, many people think is a derogatory word, but that is only owing to the anti-Semitic protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, supposedly, are the minutes of a meeting that takes place once every 100 years from the leaders of world Jewry who get together to plan the course of history. And having recently returned from one of these meetings, I could tell, well, actually, I can't tell you. But the protocols of the Elders of Zion have the word goyim used in a very derogatory fashion. Obviously, as you would expect anti-Semites trying to stir up anti-Semitism to do, goyim in the protocols are subjugated, goyim are to be enslaved, their money is to be taken away, blah, blah, blah. The truth of the matter, however, is that goyim literally means Gentiles. It literally means somebody who is not Jewish. But that's not exactly true. What it literally means is nations. And the word goyim morphed from nations into Gentiles. And very interestingly, the Ethiopian Jewish community as well had the latter definition for the word goyim as meaning Gentiles, the same way as the word is used in the vernacular of world Jewry. Very interestingly. A 17th century Jesuit claimed that the Ethiopian Jews had the Hebrew Bible, which is almost certainly not accurate. He's probably either mistaken or was not completely honest. Unfortunately, many people who went out to far-flung areas reported back things that were not true because they figured that nobody will ever be able to fact-check them. To give you another example, in China, which we've discussed, in China, the book of Maccabees 2 was claimed by a minister to exist in the original Hebrew, which would certainly be quite a surprise, considering that all literary evidence from the text itself points to the book of Maccabees 2 having been originally written in Greek. Nevertheless, this minister in China had something to prove, and I suppose that the fellow in Ethiopia had something to prove as well. Back to the guy in China, though, interestingly as well, they were looking for references to Jesus in the Bible of the Chinese Jews, because there was a belief among a few people, very few, but there was a belief that perhaps the Jewish Bible at one point did mention Jesus by name, but that later on it was taken out by the rabbis. And therefore they figured that coming across this group of Jews in China who have been separated from so long from the body of world Jewry, they would be able to find the original text which mentioned Jesus. Needless to say, they found no such text. But what one minister claimed was that they did have a tradition of Jesus' arrival, in that he asked them, how do you understand the verse at the end of Genesis when Jacob blesses Judah? And he says, Lo yasur shevet me Yehuda, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, umechokek mi bein raglav, nor decision-making from his descendants, ad ki yavo Shiloh, until the coming of Shiloh, which generally speaking, according to most commentators, is understood to refer to the Messianic era. And according to him, the Jewish community of China had the word Shiloh as a mnemonic device, Shin Yud Lamed Hey, which somehow spelled out words relating to some sort of God-man. Although obviously that's fraudulent. The truth of the matter regarding the Ethiopian Jews is that their Bible is in Ge'ez, the sacred language of Ge'ez related to the language they speak of Amharic, and it is exactly the same as the Bible utilized by the Ethiopian Coptic Church. Which brings us to the opinion of the majority of scholars that the Ethiopian Jews, or the Falasha, perhaps we should call them at this point, the Falasha are not descended from Jews, but rather are a break-off sect from the Ethiopian Church. Even so, it doesn't make that much of a difference today, because a convert is considered as much a Jew as anybody who is born Jewish, and in a certain sense even more so. The Bible commands Jews to love converts an additional time over the fact that it tells Jews to love each other. it says an additional commandment of making sure to love the convert and cherish the convert. But I do find it fascinating to look at the fact that the Ethiopian Jews, similar to one of the communities in Libya, is the only other community that is found to be unrelated to world Jewry through their father's side. Jews from all over the world, as mentioned, I believe we mentioned already, Jews from Rome and from Kurdistan and from Eastern Europe and from Morocco, from all over the globe, have been found to be very closely related, with the exception thus far, at least what the tests have shown, of some communities in Libya and the Ethiopian Jews. Ethiopian Jews have been found to be genetically very closely related to other Ethiopians, although even among Ethiopian Jews, there are a number of different, I won't say races, but there are different ethnicities, which shouldn't be surprising because in their own history, they have time periods when they were involved in spreading the word, when they were involved in gaining proselytes. And therefore, it's to be expected that there would be a mixture of ethnicities among the Ethiopian Jews, but they've been found, generally speaking, to be closely related to other Ethiopians, and to a certain degree, some of their genes match up with some people in Yemen, which is to be expected, considering that Yemen practically touches Ethiopia. Not actually Ethiopia, it practically touches Djibouti, but Djibouti is a newly minted country right on the border of Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian Jews, interestingly enough, may have some Jewish ancestors, whether physically or spiritually, which we're going to be discussing. What I mean by this is a physical ancestor is that, in fact, they may descend from certain Jews of old. A spiritual ancestor may mean that they were converted by some Jews or a certain Jew of old, but that they did not make up their religion on their own, because that would mean that they have no connection actually with the Jewish people of the Bible. And we're going to see what evidence there is for such an argument in either direction. By the way, this is very important to realize that in many records, when people spoke of Ethiopia, or when they spoke of Nubia, or they spoke of Cush, they were talking about all of Africa. In some instances, in fact, people were so unclear on geography that they were talking about India and other places that have no relationship whatsoever to Ethiopia. Therefore, not every mention of Cush includes Ethiopia, nor should it, considering that Cush was north of Ethiopia. But generally speaking, outsiders would refer to Cush or Nubia or Ethiopia and be referring to either all of Africa or at the least East Africa, which is below Egypt. And at the very least, if we have to include Ethiopia within Cush, for example, we also have to include Eritrea, Djibouti, perhaps Somalia, and certainly Sudan. And you should recognize that Sudan alone, which is above Ethiopia, is over 100 times the size of Israel. So Jews very likely could have ended up in Cush at some point or another, and sooner or later assimilated into the general populace, and be completely unrelated to the Falasha, who are independently arisen. So simply because we have references of Jews in Cush does not necessarily mean that these Falasha come from those Jews. Now, the most controversial Falasha story today are not the Falasha themselves, who are in Israel, regardless of what their ancestry may be, are in Israel and have joined the Jewish people and are one with the Jewish people, but rather the Falash Mura. The Falash Mura were not considered Jews in 1991, but today they are considered to be Jews, although they do have to undergo a conversion before coming to Israel, and about 20,000 Falash Mura are slowly and steadily making their way to Israel. Very interestingly, they claim to belong to Falasha, they claim to belong to Beta Israel, who were to a degree forcibly converted by Christian missionaries about 200 years ago. Now, first of all, the force in this instance would really be not a physical force, not a threat of death, but rather a force of offering benefits to people who converted to Christianity, and certainly a lot of that went on. Nevertheless, we don't know for sure that anybody claiming that they belong to these Falash Mura today, in fact, do descend from the Falasha, from the Beta Israel of old, and it's understandable, very understandable, as to why people would claim that they descend from the Falasha even if they don't, and it seems there are a great many people like this. It's understandable why people would claim that they descend from the Falasha and that they are now the Falash Mura who want to revert to being Jewish. They want to be Jewish once again because they want to get out of Ethiopia and they want to get into the first world country of Israel. And I would venture to say that every single one of us would do the same. One would have to be a fool and not care about his or her own family if they would not be willing to do such a thing, to perhaps even lie by hook or by crook to try to get out of famine-ridden, disease-ridden, war-ridden Ethiopia and to get into Israel. In any event, regardless of whether the average Falash Mura is in fact descended from the Beta Israel or not, the Falash Mura certainly were Christians in very recent times. As a matter of fact, you can see in Israel today a great many girls, Falash Mura girls, who have a cross tattooed onto their forehead. Now, it's very interesting to see the Arab response to the Ethiopian Falasha Mura coming to Israel. The Arab take on the matter is rather schizophrenic. First of all, they stopped Operation Moses, which began, technically speaking, in 1977, but the actual Operation Moses, bringing Ethiopian Jews over to Israel by their thousands, took place in late 1984 through early 1985. It was eventually stopped by the Arabs, who put pressure upon Sudan and others not to allow these Ethiopian Jews to make their way to Israel, because obviously the Arabs don't want more Jews moving to Israel. The second Arabic response, and occasionally you can find all four such responses within the same article, kind of like the way the Arabs deal with the Holocaust. They say, first of all, it never happened. The Jews made up the whole thing. Second of all, the Jews are the real Nazis. You see what the Jews are doing, the massacres they perpetrate in Jenin. The Jews are the Nazis. Swastika equals Star of David. And third of all, the Jews got what they deserved, and we applaud the Nazis. We always supported them and continue to. So this sort of contradictory viewpoint, whereby a few different opinions on the same matter could be put forth, all to supposedly further their disinformation goal, is perhaps to be expected. So first of all, the Falasha Mura, they try to stop even the Falasha from coming to Israel. Second of all, they say Israelis are racist, Israelis hate blacks, and that Israelis consider blacks to be Untermenschen, which is very interesting because Israel tried to bring thousands of Ethiopian Jews out of Ethiopia in order to bring them to Israel, when it was the Arabs who were trying to stop them from making their way to Israel. In matter of fact, this is the first time in history that a white country brought thousands of black Africans out of Africa, not for purposes of slavery, but for freedom. The third Arabic response is that the Zionists are trying to boost the Jewish demographics, and that these Falasha Mura are not really Jews, and that the true Ethiopian Jews are against bringing these Falasha Mura, but the evil Zionists hate the real Ethiopian Jews so much that they're bringing these Falasha Mura even against the wishes of the Ethiopian Jews. Now, there is actually a thread of truth to that. And the bit of truth to that is that many of the Falasha Mura, as mentioned, actually do not descend from the Falasha and are people just making up a claim for very understandable reasons. And some Ethiopian Jews are against bringing in massive amounts of their former neighbors, whom they've had even some strife with over the course of the centuries, if these people are not actually descended from Jews. But certainly that's not the Arabs' concern. And the fourth Arabic response is that the Falasha Mura are obviously not Jews. It's laughable to claim that they're Jews. And of course, by extension, all of the Falasha are not Jews. It's laughable to say that they're Jews. And this just proves that none of the people claiming to be Jews in Israel are really Jews, and that the people of the Bible who lived in Israel at one point have completely vanished, and that all of the people claiming to be Jews today are truly descended from converts and have no right to be in Palestine. If the Arab countries are not welcoming the Falasha Mura with open arms, it's interesting to see who is. Curiously, the chief advocate in Israel of bringing in the Falasha Mura is the Shas party. Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party. Now, I should tell you what Sephardic means because I use the terms often. First, let's start with Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz, technically speaking, is meant to refer to parts of Germany and France. Sephard, technically speaking, is meant to refer to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and by extension, Portugal. And therefore, people who are called Ashkenazi, Ashkenazim, or Ashkenazic are Jews, generally speaking, whose roots are in parts of Russia and in Europe, while Sephardim, or Sephardic people, or Sephardis, are Jews whose roots are in Spain, before the Jews were kicked out of Spain and Portugal in the late 15th century. But generally speaking, today, in the vernacular, the way people speak, Sephardi refers to anybody who is not Ashkenazi. In other words, anybody who is not descended from the Jews of Europe and westernmost Russia is considered to be Sephardi, even though technically speaking it isn't so. For example, Iranian Jews, Kurdish Jews, and Yemenite Jews, to varying degrees, but they have almost no Sephardic heritage whatsoever, and it's unfortunate that this blurring of definitions has taken place. The reason why the definitions have been blurred is because the Sephardic Jews who made their way out of Spain and Portugal went to a number of different communities throughout the Middle East, and in many instances they took over those communities. They gave over their customs to the communities, they intermarried with the community, and the community then came to follow Sephardic rituals, Sephardic liturgy, and Sephardic customs. But in any event, back to the Shas party, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, politics, generally speaking, is dirty business. And the Shas party in Israel has been a bit of an enigma, and some people have very little respect for the Shas party. They seem to be for sale on almost every subject except for the Sephardic revolution that they've been trying to lead in recent years in Israel. And it seems very strange to people that they are now championing the cause of non-Sephardic Christians. See, remember, these are ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they're very into the Sephardic community, and now they're championing non-Sephardic Christians. And some would claim that they're doing it in order to gain votes. They want to get the votes of these Falash Mura, and as well they want to get the votes of all of the Ethiopian Jews living in Israel. But it would seem perhaps that what's going on may be something like what might be going on with regard to Rabbi Avichayil and the group of Indians that he's interested in claiming as Jews and bringing to Israel and converting, in that every Orthodox rabbi agrees that once somebody converts, then they are accepted as a complete Jew. So Rabbi Avichayil with the Indian Jews and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the head of the Sephardic party, the Shas party, with regard to the Ethiopians, recognize that the people that they bring over who undergo completely kosher and Orthodox conversions will be accepted as Jews by all other Jews and will be trained in their own academies. And therefore, these Falash Mura who will be brought over will probably be raised as Sephardic Jews, even though obviously they have no Spanish connection. They'll be raised as Sephardic Jews, and therefore they will be one of us, so far as the Shas party is concerned. In any event, I would say keep an eye on this. It's bound to be a very interesting story to see the relationship between the Shas leadership and the Falash Mura progress over the course of the next few years and decades.